And now we would like to invite Honorable Dr. Mohamad Damak, Global Head of Islamic Finance and Poor Global Ratings Dubai UAE, to present a topic on Global Islamic Finance Outlook 2022-2023. Tafaddal.
All right. Very good afternoon, and it's a pleasure to be here physically, finally. My name is Mohamad Damak. I'm the Global Head of Islamic Finance at S&P Global Rating. And over the next 15 to 20 minutes, I'll try to take you through our view on the outlook for the industry for 2022 and 2023. I'll start talking about the key trend that we've been observing in the industry, and then I'll talk about the challenge and opportunities that the industry is facing today. And finally, I'll leave a little bit of space so that you can ask your question. I understand there's an application that you can use to ask questions, so please don't hesitate to submit them. I'll try to devote a little bit of time at the end to go through these questions. Now, where do we stand on the industry? All right. Now, the good news is that the Islamic finance industry continues to grow. It continues to grow at a double digit. And if you look at this chart, you can see that the industry at the end of 2021, the total size of the industry at the end of 2021 was $2.5 trillion with a growth rate of double digit. And we forecast the growth rate to remain strong at around 10% in the next 12 to 24 months. As you can see here, we decided to exclude Iran from our calculation. A few years ago, we used to include Iran in the calculation of the total size of the Islamic finance industry, but we decided to start excluding the country last year in the outlook of 2020, and that's because of the extreme volatility in the exchange rate of the country that could have made it impossible to come up with a clear view on where the industry is heading. So we decided to exclude Iran, and as you can see also from this chart, the industry is still concentrated. The banking assets still make around 70% of the total size of the industry, followed by the sukuk market, and then a bit of contribution from the takaful industry and the fund industry. In terms of sukuk issuance, although we think that the overall contribution to the growth will be positive, meaning that there will be more sukuk issuance than sukuk maturities this year, we think that there will be a significant slowdown in the issuance this year, and that's underpinned primarily by the changing global liquidity condition picture. I think global liquidity is becoming more scarce and more expensive as the global central bank continue to raise their rates to fight inflation. We also see lower financing needs at some of the core Islamic finance countries, especially those who are oil exporting, which would result in lower issuance in these countries. And notwithstanding the fact that some of them will continue to issue sukuk primarily denominated in local currency in order to develop the local currency market, we think that the overall volume of issuance is likely to decline to $130 billion in 2022 compared with $147 billion in 2021. Added to that, the complexity related to sukuk issuance, which we will discuss in a few minutes. But before that, I'd like to touch upon the main challenges that the industry face. And in our view, the industry faces two challenges. The first one is the industry's inability to expand beyond its own turf. We did an exercise of comparing the distribution of the industry assets by country in 2012, and we compared that to the same distribution in 2021. And guess what? The distribution looks identical, meaning that it's the same countries that have been contributing to the industry, and the industry has been enabled to attract interest from other jurisdictions, especially the non-Muslim jurisdictions. We've seen some sporadic activities here and there with the UK issuing sukuk, for example, with other sukuk issuance or other expansion in some African countries. But overall, the industry remains concentrated in the same original core countries. And actually, people talk about the global Islamic finance industry, but there is no such a global Islamic finance industry. It's a collection of small industries around the world, and the only thing that integrates them is the global sukuk market, where the volume of issuance is typically between $30 to $40 billion denominated in foreign currency. And one of the reasons why the volume of issuance is not picking up is the complexity related to the sukuk transaction versus conventional bonds. And this complexity has been also increased with the recent adoption of the AOEF Standard 59. AOEF is the Accounting and Auditing Organization for Islamic Financial Institution. It's a standard setting body based in Bahrain. Its standards have been adopted by 20 jurisdictions who have either partially or fully adopted the Sharia standards of the AOEF, plus the Islamic Development Bank. Most of these jurisdictions are key players, but there are some key industry players in Islamic finance that did not adopt the AOEF standards, such as Malaysia, for example. And the reason why AOEF Standard 59 was problematic, it increased the risks to the investors to a certain extent. Now, let's take a step back and talk about a little bit what is the Standard 59 and why it has caused so much headache to the lawyers and to the investors over the last 18 months. Standard 59 is the standard that talks about the tangibility ratio in sukuk transaction. Tangibility is a concept that is used in a hybrid structure where you have two legs. One, for example, ijara or wakala leg, and one murabaha leg where you have intangible assets or commodity. Now, prior to Standard 59, there was a requirement at the inception of the transaction to have a tangibility ratio of a minimum 51%, meaning that at least 51% of the underlying assets of the transaction had to be made of tangible assets. But then once the transaction is issued, the maintenance of the 51% was on a best effort basis. Now with Standard 59, the maintenance of the 51% becomes an obligation. It becomes an obligation throughout the lifetime of the transaction, meaning that if the ratio is no longer respected, then you need to have some provision in the legal documents on how to deal with that situation. And typically when the ratio drops between 51 and 33%, there are some provisions in the legal documents that state that the issuer should work with its Sharia advisors to bring the ratio back to 51% at least. And if the ratio drops below 33%, then the sukuk needs to be delisted, and investors are given the option to ask for the money back before the maturity of the transaction. Now, why this is relevant to the investor? This is relevant because it exposed them to additional residual asset risks. Imagine, for example, that the tangibility ratio is crossed because of a partial loss event or any other event related to the valuation of the underlying assets. So investors, when you compare investors in a sukuk versus investor in a conventional bond, they are now exposed to a higher residual asset risk. Investors and issuers are now exposed to higher liquidity risk, because if the ratio drops below 51% or if the ratio drops below 33%, then the sukuk is typically accelerated. And imagine a corporate with a $500 million sukuk that was expected to expire in 2030 that becomes immediately exigible once the ratio is crossed. The corporate might struggle to have the necessary amount of liquidity to pay back the investors. And that's again a risk that investors are starting to realize, and that investors are starting to ask for additional premium for that exposure to this risk. Despite Standard 59 debate and despite all the gloom and doom coming from the changing global liquidity condition, we still think that there are some opportunities for the Islamic finance industry, and we think that there are three main opportunities that the industry could leverage going forward in order to accelerate further its growth. The first opportunity is related to inclusive standardization, inclusive and pragmatic standardization. I think what Standard 59 has created is a situation whereby the process of issuing sukuk, which many stakeholders and many market participants, including yourselves, have been working on sukuk for the past several years and have tried to achieve a certain level of standardization of the legal documents, of the process of issuance of the sukuk in order to make it as friendly to the issuer as the process for issuing a conventional bonds. And yet with Standard 59, we're back to square zero, whereby lawyers and investment bankers had to scratch their head and go back to the drawing table in order to find a situation whereby both the interest of the issuers, the scholars, and the investors are preserved. And in our view, it's only when we will continue to experience challenges related to standards and standardization, and it's only when the scholars would push too much so that the fixed income characteristics of the sukuk are removed, then the market will be disrupted significantly. And in order to avoid that situation, we think that there is a necessity to have a critical view of the existing standards and to adopt a pragmatic approach similar to the one that was adopted by some core Islamic finance countries, whereby you have all the different spectrum of the products and you let the issuers and the investors select which are the products that correspond to their profile and that corresponds to their financing needs. So inclusive standardization is definitely an opportunity for the Islamic finance industry in our view. And once we reach a point where the process of issuance of sukuk is equivalent to the process of issuing a bond from a time, effort, and opportunity perspective, we think that could open the market to a significant number of new investors that have been eagerly looking at the sukuk market for the past many years and that have decided to walk away when they saw the amount of money and time they should invest in order to be able to make it to the finish line with the sukuk versus the amount of time and money they should invest if they were to go with a conventional bond. So opportunity number one is inclusive standardization. Opportunity number two, I think this was already touched upon in the previous panel. It's related to green and social financing. Hopefully, I won't surprise you when I say that there's a natural alignment between the maqasid al-sharia and the ESG factors. For example, one of the maqasid is to protect life, which could work well with the objective of preserving environment, for example. And given the concentration of the Islamic finance industry in oil exporting countries, and given the fact that many of them have a well-defined agenda for the energy transition out of oil towards more sustainable energy production, we think that there are significant opportunities when it comes to the issuance of sustainability and green sukuk. I think we started to see that happening over the last few years, and with an acceleration in the first half of 2022, where we have observed almost $4 billion of sustainability sukuk issued, compared with $5.3 billion for the full year of 2021. And one opportunity there is also related to the social aspect of Islamic finance, where we observed over the last couple of years, and especially as we come off the pandemic, we observed some issuance of social sukuk. Malaysia, for example, issued the Priatine sukuk that was well subscribed by the investors, and we saw the Islamic Development Bank also issuing a couple of sustainability sukuk. And beyond the sukuk market, I think there are products in Islamic finance like waqf and zakat that could be leveraged, that if leveraged properly, could help to achieve a more sustainable and a more inclusive growth. We expect investor demand to remain high when it comes to products with sustainability tag or with ESG consideration going forward, and we think that we would see more activity in that domain in the sukuk market in the next few years. Third opportunity is related to digitalization, and digitalization here beyond, I think in the previous panel someone talked about the remittances, and in the Gulf we live in a region whereby expats remit every year more than $100 billion to their country of origin, and I think the people understood that there is a significant opportunity in the money transfer and payment businesses, and that's why if you look at the majority of the fintech in the different cohorts of the fintech hive or the Qatar Financial Center or any other accelerator, you would see that there's typically a significant number of fintech working on the money transfer and payment solutions. But digitalization goes beyond that, and I think one key opportunity when it comes to digitalization is the issuance of digital sukuk, because it could open the door to a significant number of new issuers and a significant numbers of new investors that are today excluded from the market. Over the lunch, we had a quick discussion with a friend, and he was telling me that he had some discussion with some of the investment bankers on a company that was willing to issue $100 million sukuk, and no one was interested in that because the size was too small in order to interest the investment bankers or the lawyers. And I think digital sukuk, issuing sukuk through a platform, for example, whereby as the CFO of the company, you log into the platform, you select the legal documents to be used, which happen to be standardized and perfectly agreed upon within the market. You plug in your underlying assets, you start to build your book, and investors get an alert. The company XYZ is interested in raising $20 million or $5 million or $3 million sukuk, and the investors can log in, and if the company and the sector and the activity corresponds to their risk profile, then they could start to build the book, and then once the book is totally built, then the sukuk is effectively created on the platform, and it's all dealt with using smart contract. And I think that would help to improve market efficiency, because you would have standard legal documents, you would have smart contracts that would tackle all the operational aspects related to the sukuk management, that would lower the counterparty risk, that would lower the cost of administration, would lower the overall cost for the issuers and for the investors, and would open the sukuk market to the so-called small issuers that have been sidelined for the time being from the market, and also for the investors, because if you read the legal documents of the sukuk, typically there's a minimum entry ticket size, which is typically in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, which excludes de facto a significant number of investors that cannot have this minimum investment size. But obviously that assumes that you have the proper regulatory environment in place, that you have all the operational prerequisites, such as, for example, the central bank digital currency to be able to clear and manage the transaction efficiently on the blockchain. So overall, I think if I were to leave you with 3 key takeaways, the first one would be that the industry will continue to expand. The outlook is positive. The industry is concentrated in oil exporting countries with oil at triple digit. There are opportunities for the industry to continue to grow, although we will see lower growth in terms of sukuk issuance in 2022 compared with last year, but the overall contribution would still be positive because we would likely see more sukuk issuance than sukuk maturity this year. Concentration in oil exporting country and complexity related to transaction are the key factors holding back the industry. from a significant expansion beyond its own country of origin. And we see three main opportunities for the industry. The first one is digitalization, particularly for sukuk and sukuk issuance. Second one is ESG alignment. And the third one is the inclusive and pragmatic standardization. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and would open for Q&A.
Yes.
Thank you, Mohamad. My name is Ayman. I'm from the Qatar Financial Center Authority. Could you perhaps quickly talk about, I mean, we know Malaysia has a very deep local currency, sukuk skewed market. Could you perhaps talk about the trend and the recent development that are happening in the region, in the GCC, and what's your, basically, what's the outlook for local currency sukuk issuances in the region? Thank you.
Right, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for your question. I think in the region, what we have observed is mainly Saudi Arabia trying to develop its local currency, local capital markets. It started with an unlimited sovereign sukuk program, under which the government would typically issue between $15 to $25 billion equivalent in local currency. And that was designed in a way to show the way for the private sector issuers in order to start to develop some disintermediated form of financing. Because remember, and I think this is really important, because typically in the regions, the regulators tend to be among the first to adopt international regulations. Like, for example, the first country in the world that has adopted Basel II was Kuwait. But with the regulations such as recovery and resolution regime, we had the impression that the regulators in the region were dragging their feet, and only Oman published a 16 pages document calling it a recovery and resolution regime. And the reason why the regulators were doing that, it's because the banking system was the only game in town to finance the economy, and investors were taking comfort from the fact that the government was standing behind the banking system. And in fact, if you, at S&P, when we assessed the probability of support of the government towards the banking system, we think that 4 out of the 6 countries of the GCC are highly supportive towards the banking system. The 2 exceptions are Oman and Bahrain for obvious capacity reasons. So the governments have delayed the adoption of recovery and resolution regime in order to avoid a situation whereby they jeopardize or send the wrong signal to the investors that they will be no longer standing behind the banking system. And one prerequisite to adopt that would be to have a vibrant local currency market that could be used or that could be leveraged in order to finance the economy. Now, long story short, so today in the GCC, only Saudi Arabia has started the journey of developing the local capital market. We've seen also the UAE issuing in local currency. We think that there will be more issuance. But going forward, I think that the development of a local capital market would be a must in order to ensure a higher option for the financing of the economies in the GCC. Any recent or major sukuk default? I think there were a couple of them, a restructuring rather than a default. There was a default actually by Serba Dynamic, but it was related to a general default of the company on its financial obligations. But there were also a restructuring of the sukuk issued by Garuda Indonesia last year. And I think one of the reasons why we're concerned about Standard 59 is that Standard 59 makes the transaction more complex compared with what they are today, and some issuers could use some of the legal loopholes in order to push investors to restructure their sukuk. And I think there was a case, for example, a few years ago, whereby one of the sukuk issuers have claimed that their sukuk was no longer in compliance with Sharia and pushed investors to restructure and to come back to the negotiation table. Now, the more complexity in the sukuk legal documentation, the more this scenario could arise in the future. Can we go back to the questions?
We have one more question. Yes? No? Okay. Yes? We can only accept one more question.
Right, one more question. So, how efficient is sukuk raised for major infrastructure project? Yeah, this is probably an important question in a sense that we usually hear that Islamic finance and sukuk issuance could be the panacea for the chronicle deficit of infrastructure in Africa because of the principle of asset backing of Islamic finance, and because by definition, if you have an infrastructure, then you have a physical asset. Now, it's true that there could be some opportunities, but we haven't seen really a takeoff in the volume of issuance, again, because of the factors that I explained earlier, typically the complexity related to sukuk issuance, and also the for some of the African countries, the low creditworthiness that could make them that could lead to an exclusion from the investors' radar, for example. So in theory, yes, there are a lot of opportunities, but in reality, these opportunities are much more difficult to implement, which again highlights the importance to have the inclusive and pragmatic standardization of the legal documents of the industry.
Okay. Thank you, sir, for this
Thank
special
you.
presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, round of applause for our presenter. And now we would like to invite Mr. Makhtar Abdullah, CEO of ASAS, to present the memento to our presenter. Sir, can you please remain on stage? Thank you again.